Hello again. This time, making another video. I wanted to talk about how to make great villains because that seems to be a topic that comes up a lot in the D&D vlogging sphere. Um, One of the things that I think is really important when you talk about making villains in Dungeons and Dragons is that a D&D gaming villain, first of all, is not the same as a storybook villain or a movie villain. It has some moving parts that those other mediums don't have. And what I mean is what makes it different, and this is what I'll talk about, but the big thing that makes it different is that this is a villain that you interact with, right? You don't interact with movie villains. It's just one way, right? It's coming at you. Same with story villains, all these things. Gaming villains interact with you, and that makes it very different. And this is the thing that I think most people miss when they make their videos. Um, when it comes to making a great villain, there's a couple of things. It's actually easier than you might expect. Um, if it comes to, you want to make this great backstory, and your villain of your story for the players has this interesting motivation and who he is. Unfortunately, the reality is most players don't really care about any of that, and you have to work it in just so that they even know about it, right? So you're kind of having to spoon feed them what, or not even spoon feed, just force feeding them information about your villain, whether or not they care. Now, one of the things that I think is worth thinking about when it comes to understanding what makes a villain, and this is what makes good D&D villains, is that if you look at the great stories, or great villains in stories, when we can pick a few, I think Darth Vader is a good example, where everybody knows Darth Vader, right? Darth Vader, at what point does he become a great villain? And at this point, he's such an iconic figure that people forget. You have to go way back to understand at what point he became the great villain. I mean, now he appears in the movie and people root for him, like in was it a Rogue Force One or Rogue One, Rogue One. Yeah, he showed up at the end and everybody's like, "Yay, Darth Vader!" And he's technically a bad guy, right? Now, if you go back to the original Star Wars, there's something that happens that creates the villain. The first scene, maybe it's not the exact, yeah, it's the first scene. They go on the ship and Darth Vader comes aboard. He's the bad guy. But at what point does he become the villain, like a true memorable villain? And this is a key feature. He does something. He does something that makes you not like him, or at least gives him a sinister aura. And what he does, don't mind my phone, is that he kills Obi-Wan Kenobi. That's the moment. That's the moment that Darth Vader becomes the villain. There's an action that he does. You like Obi-Wan Kenobi, really fuck off. Let me put this on mute real quick. Might edit that out, but I don't believe in editing. One shot, one take. Um, he does something. The villain does something. Another example would have been, maybe like half of the characters from Game of Thrones. Joffrey, the king, right? The early king. What does he do to make you hate him? At first, he's an obnoxious, unlikable guy, but he kills Ned Stark. Now he's the villain, right? And that's the key you have to remember, is that the villain has to do something that makes them the villain. This is where your campaign comes in. So there's sort of ways to go about this, and I thought I'd simplify this in sort of 3 very easy steps. All right. First step is put some effort into planning your villain. Don't overdo it, though. Just have an idea of what your villain is, maybe some core motivations, and what he's about, maybe a personality profile. Right? You just want to decide, is this person a local crime boss? Is he some kind of mercenary that's out to get you, or the PCs? Is he some sort of evil mastermind, just a sort of dark minion of a greater power? So, like, Darth Vader for the Emperor, those kind of things. And if you can, try to add some sort of unusual dimension. Just it doesn't have to be elaborate. It can be a little thing. Make him a halfling, right, or her a halfling, because you usually don't have villains who are halflings, right, or a dwarf, or something of the sort. Maybe it's something different. It's a nefarious treant in the woods. I don't know, whatever, but it makes it more memorable, right? Plan your villain and give him some memorable features. Um, Now, a lot of what makes great villains, just as a side note, when you can't really plan for, is that the role playing of the villain goes a long way, right? If you're a good role playing DM and you're good at voices and really getting into the character, that always makes it better. It's hard to plan for that. You can practice that and maybe you get good at it, and that'll definitely help. But what you should focus on more is sketching out your villain, get a rough sketch, and then plan how that villain is going to interact with the PCs, right? And that's the important thing to plan. Make sure there are points of contact where there's going to be some moment where the villain becomes the villain, or the antagonist or this one NPC becomes their villain. He's going to do something to them, right? And if you can plan this, plan on not having them die right away, right? You don't want villains where you just encounter and you fight and you either win or lose, right? You want encounters that are sort of, the PCs are doing something else and an NPC comes in, screws everything up, and then retreats. And now the players hate this guy. And that's what you want. You want not necessarily we really hate that guy, but that desire, that interest to go after this person, to learn more about them so they can get them, right? That's what makes your good gaming villains. And gaming villains should have, personality traits that sometimes they're irrational. They're maybe hyper focused on getting the PCs, or whatever. But the point we'll get to is you plot out your villain and figure out how it's going to interact with the PCs, at what point and in what way, right? So that's number one. Number two is work this into your storyline so that the villain sort of emerges. Don't force feed the villain. It's actually not that, this actually less is more here, right? And the reason I say to do that, you can sort of have your iconic villain, and this guy's going to be the villain. But what I like to do, and so it feels a little more natural, is that they don't know exactly who the villain is until the villain does the thing that makes them the villain, right? And it's a sort of discovery moment, and it feels more natural, right? As opposed to saying in the very first encounter, there's this evil orc sorcerer in this old keep, and that's who the bad guy is, right? It's sort of better if they encounter this guy and at first they're like, what's this guy's deal? And then he kills their favorite NPC and they're like, what the? Oh, screw this guy. And then they sort of discover more about him, right? It gives it an element of interest and engagement. It can be, leave some mystery. Maybe it's just a figure in black and they just see his face, and then the rest of the time they have to figure out who this guy is. That increases their interest in this character. Also, doing it this way allows you to create a small cast of potential villains, or rather, we can say opposed NPCs. And if there's one that emerges that really gets the PCs interested in, you let that character, that NPC, sort of become more important, right? You sort of work it in. If they suddenly decide that, screw the innkeeper at this place, well, work in some more stuff on that innkeeper. Now you've had this villain arise from the campaign, from the adventure, from the game organically, rather than being created and thrust to them. And you are still doing that, but it's much more subtle, right? And then, so you plan how this villain is going to emerge, right? Or rather, lack of planning sometimes. But I hope I don't know if I'm explaining that very well. Just think of those moments. Think of the moment that you want to use to create the villain. And this, I forgot if I was on one or two. So letting the villain emerge. That's the second point, right? Don't overplan it. And third would be decide what angle how you're going to about pissing off the PCs, for lack of a better word. So what is this villain going to do? Sometimes it happens very organically. Like, I can give you an example. So I had a campaign where we're in the city. The PCs are in the city. In the city, I designed various gangs that control the city, and different areas were controlled by different gangs. Each gang had a gang leader. And one of the gangs was headed by a guy who I had named Gorgeous Gary, who was an assassin, right? And whenever you fought with their gang members, there was a chance that Gorgeous Gary would, slip out of the shadows and take a shot at one of the PCs. So what happened was they were fighting these guys, and the gang leader, Gorgeous Gary, came out of the shadows and did like an assassinate, and it worked, and it killed one of the PCs, who was later resurrected. But that PC was furious, right? They're like, we have to kill them, screw this gang. What made it even more epic, this guy was a minor character that after this, I started developing into a more important villain just because they hated him so much. The next time they encountered this gang, they were on their guard, right? They're like, we're watching the crowd, if there's anybody around, if Gary's coming out, and they end up calling him Gary Glitter out of spite. And of course he was there, and so one of the characters was like, I'm watching right here. Is there anybody in that crowd that's coming out? And he rolled like a 1 on his spot check, even though he knew he was there. We all knew he was there, but he rolled a 1, and he was like, whatever. Right? And so I was like, oh yeah, you spot him I still gave it to him. You spot him at the last minute, but he still attacks you, and then he crit him and killed another one. And they're like, fuck this guy. It was hilarious. And that crit, and so I worked that guy. That guy was a recurring villain for quite a while until they killed him. But created a great villain. It just happened in the game. You know what I mean? Let that happen. That makes for the best villains, and just kind of be aware of that, right? That's what he did to inspire hatred. This is what I mean by letting the villain emerge. Now, the other thing you can do, and this I guess will be our third point, is really set it up to where the villain does something specifically that's sort of more planned to the PCs that gets them pissed off. Now, what a lot of people do, and it's kind of overdone to the point of being a cliche, is that whoever's your NPC quest giver is actually out to get you, right? There's a lot of players that are just paranoid of every NPC now. They're like, no, we don't trust anybody, because that happens so often. You can do that. It has to be done well at this point. If your players have been playing for a long time, it's not going to surprise them. They're just as likely to kill your NPC, especially the murder hobo types. It's never going to work on them. Other things you can do is have a villain emerge to kill an NPC, kill a different NPC who the players do like. Maybe it's their favorite innkeeper, someone who feeds them tips, and you set up a scene where that NPC is killed. That gets them to not like your villain. Killing a party member, like I mentioned, always pisses them off. At least that one party member is going to be out for revenge. But the villain can also, you can have an adventure plan, dungeon crawl or whatever, and at the last moment the villain comes and foils whatever their plan was, right? Just screws it up for them. And there's no lethality to it, but it pisses them off, right? Killing an allied NPC, you want to, I think I already talked about the ally, but things that just make life complicated for the PCs. If maybe they're doing something in a city and urban environment, and they find that they've been reported and accused to the police, and they track down who it is, it's your villain, and now they hate that guy. Things like that, right? The point is, there's a point of contact. Going back to the very first thing I said, what makes great game villains is that they're interactive. And your villain what makes or breaks villains in D&D and in games is how they interact with the players. Keep that in mind, because all these things that you see, all these videos about, your villain has to have great motivations. What does he really think? Is it really, everybody's a good guy in their own story. That's great and all, and that's good for stories, but it doesn't really matter in a game, because if this great, well thought out villain has one encounter with the PCs and just dies, or you know, it's just a straightforward hack and slash, it's not that interesting, it's not that memorable. So remember that. Point of all that is that the point of interaction, D&D villains are interactive, and that's where you need to focus your efforts. How they interact with the party, with the PCs, that's what makes great D&D villains. Thank you and good night.